Hey everybody. Before starting today's episode, I just wanted to touch on a couple things. First, I got another review on Podbean. This one is by Captain Shrapnel. Captain Shrapnel writes, "A fantastic podcast about drugs without an excessive amount of the preachy recovery talk that tends to happen when people share their experiences. Just stories of interesting people, definitely one of my favorite podcasts." Thanks, Captain Shrapnel. The next thing that I want to touch on is the new psychotropic Instagram page. I just started that up and I'm hoping to update it weekly or at least every 2 or 3 days and basically just post psychotropic related pictures. So if you have any psychotropic related pictures that you would like to see on that Instagram page, send them my way and I will definitely post them. Or if you can find a way to tag Psychotropic Podcast, do that. Again, you can send them to psychotropicpodcast@hotmail.com. Lastly, a little bit about today's episode. Hopefully not to Captain Shrapnel's dismay, this podcast or this episode is going to revolve largely around recovery. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's preachy. It's just largely recovery based. And honestly, I think it's a really good thing. The last thing I want to do, which I state in this episode, is generate content that is lopsided. I don't want to create a podcast that is just purely advocating for drug use. But I also don't want to create a podcast that is totally against drug use. I kind of want an accurate depiction of what drug use is in our society and culture and what it oftentimes entails. So, again, I think this episode is a really good one. So, having said that, I hope you enjoy it, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say. Again, get a hold of me at my email. Again, psychotropicpodcast@hotmail.com, and let me know. Looking forward to hearing from you. Enjoy.
Yeah, hi Philip.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Fantastic.
What have you been up to for the day?
Well, let's see, just the usual work stuff.
Can I ask what you do for work?
I do a lot of different things. I'm a entrepreneur.
So, just to make sure I'm on the same page as you, you don't necessarily want to talk about any illegal drugs, is that correct?
Well, I've been in recovery for 29 years, so, I'm really concerned because I help homeless people, and I see, a lot of the damage that's been done, on a first-hand basis, and so, I come from the Timothy Leary, somebody I met, I come from that whole background of mind expansion through drugs. So I thought, that might be an interesting thing. But, I'm not really, so I'm 55. I've been around quite a bit. So, I wanted to, these are things I'd be happy to get on the recorder. People need to stay employed and in tune with the work sector. So, there's kind of people who are using currently a lot of drugs that don't always realize that not everybody has an affirming view of drug use, so I don't want to give any kind of, I feel comfortable talking about pretty much anything, but I have a philosophy that people shouldn't need to talk about specifics if they don't want to. So being pressured into specifics, you always have to think, well, what if I need a job from somebody? You know, what are they going to be thinking about this? So I'll censor myself pretty much.
Psychotropic presents Robert. Excellent. Okay. And I guess the only reason I bring this up is because I don't want you to feel obligated to talk about anything that you don't want to talk about. So if it comes right down to it, just say, hey, I don't really feel comfortable talking about this. And we can kind of go around it or figure out something else, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So, but to go back to us kind of living in a society where drug users often find it difficult to imagine other people who are opposed to substance use. I experienced that firsthand a little over a year ago. I was looking for a place to live, and there was a lady who, me and her, we had become little buddies in me trying to find a place. And I was going to be moving into this apartment that she had, where she wasn't even living there. It was going to be me and another guy, and she was actually trying to rush me in there. And at the time, I worked on a marijuana farm, and I came home every time I worked smelling like weed. The terpenes that were in the air would just kind of soak into your clothing, and it almost felt like there was an oily residue on your skin and everything after you came home. And I just smelled like weed really bad, to the point where, and it happened for long enough to where I stopped smelling it, but I knew other people
Right.
could. And so I just mentioned this to her, saying, hey, I just want you to know, like, I work on a marijuana farm. And her demeanor immediately changed, and she was basically like, you know, I won't rent to you. And something about her brother. So there was something that happened between her brother and marijuana that resulted,
Yeah, psychosis. Yeah.
yeah, or something, I don't know. And so I lost out on a place to live because of substances, not even substance use on my part necessarily, although maybe she was concerned about that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of use for medicinal cannabis, but I think once people start smoking it, then that's when it gets kind of dangerous, you know, where it becomes a high instead of a medicinal thing. I think there's a difference between the two, and so that's my take on that one.
So
I think it's the same thing with alcoholism. Like you don't really usually get socially buzzed on pot. It's usually a pretty strong high, and so when people get that way on alcohol, there's kind of a stigma, you know, like, oh, this person's had a little bit too much or whatever.
and it is kind of interesting. We consider cannabis kind of a soft drug in a way, and but really it has a really overwhelming high, or it can have a really overwhelming high. And you're absolutely right. When you drink alcohol and you get to a point where people can tell you're intoxicated, oftentimes they often jump to the idea that, okay, this person's had quite a bit of alcohol, maybe they should kind of tone it down a little bit. However, when somebody smokes pot and you can noticeably tell that they're stoned, it's not ever really a case of somebody saying, or at least in my experience, somebody saying, oh, they should really just like stop, you know, they shouldn't take another hit or something. They're just like,
Right.
oh, they're just stoned.
Right, and you know, like psychiatrists will usually prescribe very heavy doses of like antidepressants or antipsychotics or whatever it is, to the point where the patient is almost like they're being stoned. It's like they sleep during the day. They're really not able to be functional. So I think once you get into that level of smoking the drug, it kind of passes that. But like, say, you know, somebody ate like a 16th of a gram a day or something like that for an antidepressant type effect. And then maybe whatever other medicinal things it might do. I mean, that's a total different relationship. And like, there are people that can get OxyContin in recovery and not want to get high off of it, and then there are people who you know, they're so-called, you know, recovered people, and you know, they can't be around the OxyContin. It's just like they have no ability to say no to that state of being high. So I think that's where the psychological empowerment, the psychological development, and the spiritual aspects come into this kind of picture, which is what I'm really interested in. You know, the recovery aspect of the brain science aspect of it.
So I guess to really jump into that, why are you interested in the recovery aspect? Well, yeah,
Oh
yeah.
well, I used to hang out with the grungers back in the '80s. I came into the Seattle scene in like 1980, and then hung out with like Soundgarden and Green River, who became I guess Pearl Jam, and those people. And they were I was like in the 100 to 200 like person in that circle, like that when it was a really small circle, and so I got into it got to the point where with all this mind expansion stuff I was doing and getting into all that stuff that I just basically got to the point where I couldn't party anymore. I graduated from college and instead of getting a good job, I just was going off on my own tangents and so I got into recovery in 1989 and it's been fine since. But for a while, it was a really dark place, and I had actually been to that same place when I was about 16, 17, because I was doing drug use back then too, and I didn't really have a good reaction at times. Sometimes I'd be very, very normal, but sometimes you can kind of tell when people are addicts, even though they might seem really normal, that they're not really able to, hold jobs or be on the same track, as other people.
Are you referring to, so say you have somebody who's an addict, even though they're in recovery, are you kind of saying that you could still kind of tell them apart because they still have trouble holding jobs, or does that change after
Oh
they?
well, that's a whole other ball game. There are a lot of people in recovery actually who go to what's called first step halls, and they're usually like people that keep relapsing. That's why they call it the first step. Like the first step is that you're powerless over drugs and alcohol. Your life has become unmanageable, and so yeah, there are people that stay in recovery that never quite get to the level of societal recovery or economic recovery, and they make recovery kind of like the main thing in their life. So they might have 5 or 10 years of recovery, but that's one of the only things as far as their gifts that they've developed.
The fact that they actually were able to remain abstinent.
Yeah, yeah, it's important because there are a lot of homeless people right now and around this country. There's just an epidemic, and a lot of it does come, from the fact that they're they have it's kind of a what's the word, not epistemological but ontological problem. It's like their ideas about life are kind of off, and when it comes to maybe contributing to society or like listening to their boss at work or thinking life is one big party kind of thing. And so I think when you're more developed, you can enjoy life at work, or as an entrepreneur, but it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be, goofy, it doesn't have to be crazy and all that stuff.
Can you describe to me? So first, I think I've suffered minor bouts of addiction in my life. I think that in my late teens and early 20s, I developed a fairly healthy cocaine habit, and then in my late 20s and early 30s, I'm 33 now, so this is something that I've kind of been able to kick out of. But I developed a pretty good habit, a pretty good marijuana habit. And I know that's kind of ha-ha to some people because it's not supposed to be physically addictive.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think you could still form a pretty nasty habit around it.
That
And
was my drug of choice, and that's what I'm in recovery from. Yeah, yeah, you can.
okay. Would you? So there's a lot of people that I don't think necessarily understand what addiction is like the mindset. They can look at behavior and they can watch things that they can watch movies that kind of portray addiction, and they can kind of look at the drug fiend scratching their arm and everything for their next fix, but they don't really understand the mindset surrounding addiction. Would you, and you had said that you were in a dark spot, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Would you
Um,
would you mind talking about what?
well, sure. The self-esteem seems to be really activated when I use the drug. I kind of become a king, when I use the drug. But when I didn't have it, things just started to really revolve around getting it. So if I didn't have the money to get it, I might hang out with some unsavory, people that I didn't find to be all that positive people at times. So there was that aspect of it. And then feeling bad about things, or maybe drinking alcohol. Because back in the 90s when I was, or 80s, there was basically it was illegal, and so it was a dangerous thing to be doing for a lot of people. And I mean, most normal people don't want to get arrested for drugs. So
Yeah, because especially since it's so smelly and everything, like it's basically advertising itself unless you keep it in a sealed container and smoke it in places that are far away from
right,
other
and then
people.
the economic aspect of it can be bad for people. Like if you really can't afford it. And then, like I said, we'll switch to alcohol, or if you can't find pot, well, maybe there's some pharmaceutical, or people will steal from their parents' drugs, or it's not a it's that need to get high that's the problem. People, normal people who had non-neglectful parents, teach them how to be like kind of a member of the tribe, like kind of a leader of the clan, kind of, you know what I mean? Like they're like teach them to be the big dog. You got these parents that kind of want their kids to succeed, and then you've got this kind of Oedipal conflict, which the true psychoanalytic meeting isn't about like sexual desire of something. It just means your dad doesn't want you to really conflict with him, compete with him. He doesn't want to see you as a chum. There's this conflict, or with the mother and the daughter, whatever. It's like the parents aren't really they don't teach kids how to have an adult life. So the pain of growing up in these dysfunctional families leads people to want to escape, want to get high, want to check out. And so instead of, like if you're an artist, musician, instead of like having these great career things happening, because the kid might still be gifted, you're not on the same track as other people. You're just kind of like, you might be making good music, but you can't sell it, or, you can't repeat it or something. So there's a lot in that, I think, what I just said about what an addict is.
But the actual mindset of addiction, you kind of hinted at the idea that while you're under the influence, a person does feel there's a confidence, right?
Yeah.
But then when you're off, there's a lack of confidence.
Yeah.
From my experience, I would say that's kind of one aspect of addiction, but that wouldn't necessarily put somebody in a dark enough spot to say want to get into recovery, right?
Well, it could. I mean, if you're not able to work, you have no self-esteem, you feel bad, you feel suicidal, those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean that's the way some people are. They just and then they get in trouble with the law. I mean, alcoholics pretty much probably more than marijuana users, but a lot of people who smoke pot do go into recovery for pot. It's maybe a myth that people don't, but there's Marijuana Anonymous, and a lot of people in AA are like cross addicted. They're not really alcoholics. There's heroin addicts in AA because they like the success rate of AA is a lot higher than NA, and so you find people who might have all kinds of addictions, even marijuana addictions, just going to AA because there's like in Seattle there's about 2,000 AA meetings a day here, so people just go to them.
Wow. So would you mind touching on what these steps are? Because honestly, I don't know what they are. I have no idea what the steps are and what they mean.
Yeah, sure.
The first one you had said was admitting that you're out of control of the substance. Is that correct?
Right. You're powerless over it. Your life is unmanageable.
What does that mean?
It means that you can't do something like somebody else. Like, say somebody gambles. some people can gamble responsibly. It's kind of a fun thing that they do with maybe a fifth of their income, or, 1% of their income. But some people just go crazy, or using credit cards. They're not able to do it responsibly, and so they realize that they need extra help and that the ordinary person doesn't need. So, and like we were talking about, like self-esteem, an addict might have a chronically low level of self-esteem that the drug helps them overcome, because the brain states that the drug produces are like the brain states of normal people, except when you start getting into like LSD and some these things like that. But so basically, the whole problem is that the first step kind of gets you out of the normal world. You're no longer quite like somebody else. You see that you're not able to drink, or you're not able to do something that other people are able to do. In the case of drugs, it is kind of dubious whether or not these things have normal uses that aren't like a medicinal aspect or a pharmacological aspect that would be administered in a non-intoxicating way. But so that's how that works. And then the second step is came to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And then the third is made a decision to turn our lives.
Hold on, wait. Here, let me back up.
Okay.
Quick. So going back to that first step, it kind of, so by basically admitting that you're different from what you perceive to be the normal population, you would almost, I feel like one could interpret that as you're kind of isolating yourself a little bit, which I think oftentimes contributes to addiction. But this program obviously helps.
Well, you're not supposed to. There's a saying like, we stop fighting everybody and everything. And, whether or not that's 100% completely moral as far as courage, and, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and, so I'm not saying that that's universally applicable, but, so there's the, the problem of being not, fighting against normal people, or seeing normal people as inferior to your little clique, in your group, or yourself as inferior to normal people. So that's a really good point.
Okay. And then you're talking about the second step as being recognizing that there's a higher power that can help you out of yours, or help you through your situation. Right.
You have a higher power, kind of a maternal or paternal combination of both, kind of caring force that's like a God of your understanding that can help you to get over this.
And it can be whatever God or power or energy you perceive to be a part of.
Right, that's correct.
Okay. And what does that do for people? Is that kind of a hope? Does that give hope, or?
Well, if you believe in the objectivity of it, it's a realistic, change of events and patterns in one's life, as a result of prayer. So there is like this idea of the pink cloud, also, where if you give yourself over to this new way of life, you're not going to set up the same causes that create the same effects. So there's like this pink cloud. Well, all that stuff that I was doing is no longer happening to me. It's amazing, and you have this kind of new life. And so a lot of people stay in the recovery their whole life, and they never relapse.
Okay, that's actually that's a really cool thought, because that suggests that, I mean, you're just kind of changing one aspect, similar to how if somebody wants to lose weight, they say, okay, just stop drinking soda, stop drinking Coca-Cola, and just see what happens there. And just changing that one little thing will augment your diet enough to get you to start shedding pounds.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how it works. Because a lot of people don't have much will. They weren't born with this problem, and they're kind of just going through life, in more or less good way. It could be a great life, but I'm just saying that, with the addict, there's this one thing that's not really necessary. The good feelings should be natural. It should come from the rewards of life, like the reward center of the brain, which naturally the brain kind of gives us all the drugs we need. We just have to, have good people around us or overcome, the bad things that happen to us. Or, but most people can't do that who are addicts. They've had too much bad stuff happen or is happening, and so they kind of check out.
Okay. All right. So, and what happens with the third step? Well, first, how many steps are there?
Oh, there's 12 steps.
There's 12 steps. Okay.
I can abbreviate the gist of them too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Run through the rest of the steps.
Well, basically, so the third step is made a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him. So, you basically, as much time you put into looking for the drug or using the drug or being high, you put into recovery, basically. And so then the fourth step is making a fearless moral inventory of yourself. And so that's like, saying, okay, well, I shouldn't have stole, money from my folks, or I shouldn't have did whatever I did. You just kind of say, well, when I was high, I did this, or, So you say, okay, this is kind of my moral inventory, and these are my good points. So it's kind of like not all negative stuff, but this is kind of where I'm at. And then the fifth step is you share that with another person that you can trust. I mean, it could be a psychiatrist or clergy or your sponsor or friend or something. And then the sixth and seventh step is like you're entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character, and you humbly ask God to remove them. That's 7. So what the steps do up to this point, they kind of show you what the drug does to you. It's kind of like when you really do the steps, they show you, well, this is kind of how I failed in my goals and dreams, or this is how I got arrested, or, I ripped off all these people for drug money, so it's like, I don't want to be that way. I want to be clean. I want to get out of it. And then the 8th and 9th step is like made a list of persons that you've harmed, and then 9th and willing to make amends, and then 9th is willing to make amends. You've made amends to these people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So you don't want to, somebody's going to be a jerk to you, or like, if it's going to injure you or them in some way, you don't need to make amends to them. And then the rest of the 3 steps are just basically kind of maintenance steps. You continue to do your personal inventory and sought through prayer and meditation, to do that, and then ask for knowledge of God's will, and have the power to carry that out. So the idea of that is kind of like, you're not just like asking for things in prayer. I mean, you can do that, but it kind of teaches you to try to know what God's will is, and whatever that is, just ask for the power to carry that out. And then the 12th is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, came to spread this message to other addicts, basically. Practice these principles in all our affairs. I hope that didn't turn anybody off, that whole thing.
What we just talked about?
Yeah.
No, dude. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is a conversation that I haven't had in any of the previous episodes that I think is extremely valuable. So truthfully, the goal that I have for this whole thing is to basically just get stories from people or hear what other people have to say about substance use in any way, and hopefully taking the whole series, I guess, as a whole, being able to come away with an accurate or somewhat accurate depiction of what substance use entails in all of its facets, so everything from hitting rock bottom to recovery, from just dabbling with psychedelics to having profound mystical experiences on psychedelics. I'd really be interested. I would love to get an episode where somebody has a positive methamphetamine experience, but I would like to juxtapose that with another episode that shows how detrimental methamphetamine is, because the last thing that I want to do is create something that is lopsided and actually misleads
Oh
people
yeah.
into thinking that substance use is okay. But I also want people to know that we create narratives in our society that actually contribute, I think, to addiction. Just
Well,
because.
that's yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, man, this is you, dude. Go ahead.
Well, there's a thing called microdoses, and there's a problem where doctors have all this arsenal of these weird new drugs, and society doesn't seem to be getting any better. In fact, we didn't have kids shooting up their classes 30 years ago, but they had all the guns. I mean, at that time, and so things don't really, depending on who you ask. I mean, it doesn't mean like we have to have a bummer day all the time. It just means that there's something kind of off in society. It's kind of getting Orwellian in some ways, and so the idea that psychiatrists have all these medications, but they're not really maybe even knowing what these medications mean. So this brain science is relatively new, say like 100 years old. And there's aspects of it, I think, that are being tapped into now that are not really understood, like treating people. So what I was talking about, I guess they call it jonesing, where you need your drug. Well, what if somebody took an antidepressant instead of that bong hit, or those 20 bong hits or whatever, or the other drugs? What if they tried something legal, And that seemed to be what happened to me in '89. I was still kind of in my addiction, and I went to a family doctor, and he prescribed me Prozac, and I slowly started getting into recovery after that, which is really interesting. And so I haven't had many times in my adult life where I've taken these medications the way they prescribed them to be taken. Like, to me, that was always debilitating, and I could not do it. But I had a really good old psychiatrist once who said, you can take it as needed. And that seemed to work. When I felt a little bit off, I was like, okay, I don't want to go smoke pot. I don't want to drink. Let's see if taking an eighth of a dose of this would work. And I guess over, like a week or whatever, it would build up, and then I would stop doing it. But they don't teach you that stuff. And I think that might be one of the possible answers to this whole epidemic, this crisis that we're having, is that like these opiate addicts, that's all they'll do. They'll just, it's got to be opium, it's got to be this high. Whereas like they don't consider maybe trying something else, enough to experiment with other things. And if those other things are like toxic at the levels these doctors are prescribing, like maybe, reduce the dose. But I can't give medical advice, obviously I'm not a doctor, but I don't know how much research has been done on this, but that's what a psychiatrist told me. So that, that might work for other people.
Yeah. I've never heard of microdosing pharmaceutical medication. I've only heard of microdosing hallucinogens and other substances. That seems to be kind of a popular fad these days. So yeah, I couldn't weigh on that one either end. Either way, it sounded like it worked for you. It seemed to slowly augment your consciousness in a way that made you want to seek out recovery.
Yeah, at the time, definitely. And from there, I've always had this interest in spirituality. And even when I was 16, I wrote a thing for my high school. Actually, it wasn't a high school newspaper. It was like some group. I don't know who they were, some nonprofit. It was just a generalized, maybe student writing thing that they distributed to the high school class. But it was In Search of the Partying Genius. I wrote this article, In Search of the Partying Genius. So like at that time, I started smoking pot even before like, I don't know, 15 or something. But I was trying to meditate to like, get out of that, because I guess I didn't want to. There's a part of me that wanted to just be into the spirituality, which promises you all these spiritual experiences and good feelings, and higher consciousness and, connection to, like knowing things that other people don't know and all that stuff. But a lot of people in those traditions say that, you can't use drugs, and that was what was told to me, that, you're not allowed to use drugs to get to these places. And so it took a long time for me to finally get into recovery. It took like 13 more years, 13. Well, it took about 10 more years, basically.
Okay. So you have meditated in the past, at least.
Yeah. I went through the whole Eastern philosophy and the esotericism thing, and met a guy who was into physical alchemy, who, you don't hear about that too much, but he went to an alchemy school in the Southwest, and I studied all that stuff. But I started studying that stuff when I was about 15, but like I said, it was like led me to a dark place, and I became a born-again Christian at 18. Then I got into like the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues and just all kinds of dream interpretation and weird things happening to me. And then I kind of backslid from that and, met all these esoteric people and stuff. And then that turned out to be a really dark place. So I basically got into Christianity. But at that time, I bought a book on psychoanalytic studies and business, because those are the two things in college I would not touch. I wouldn't touch anything to do with Western psychology, and nothing to do with like constructively learning how to deal with the world, And so so it's taken a pretty long path, and it's really hard to do your own thing, in life and succeed at it. But I think that's another aspect of drugs. They don't make you feel the failure,
Yeah, it kind of sounds like you were seeking something. You started off with kind of seeking, you said, Eastern mysticism, and you kind of migrated over to Christianity. And if I understood correctly, they both kind of led to dark places.
Well, no, the Christianity didn't lead to a dark place. The Eastern philosophy stuff did, and the esotericism, like, New Agey stuff. That did lead to a dark place. I kind of believe in two things. I believe in genius and I believe in spirituality, and the two things are kind of separate. I mean, you could be spiritual and not be a genius, and you could be a genius and not be spiritual. And I think the path is to respect genius and also be spiritual. And so, you get a lot of people that are kind of into genius, but they're not into being spiritual, and it doesn't really lead them anywhere. So, so any talk about Christianity, I have to preface it that I've done rare book sales for about 20 years, so I've got about 4,000 books in my house, and so there's a lot of seeking wisdom, in all different forms. But I think that's important when you talk about, spirituality. There's a lot of crazy spirituality. In fact, I've written books on 3 books on religious dysfunction, like hallucinations. It was one book. One was on grandiosity, which had a chapter on conspiracy theory, and then another one was on hyper-religiosity, which is kind of like the non-rational, use of religion that leads to like terrorism and stuff like that.
So I kind of had a look at just, I guess, the synopsis of one of your books, The Experience of Hallucinations in Religious Practice.
Okay.
And I was kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, Philip. I basically wrote that book because I saw a lot of people that were totally out of their mind, and they were even kind of fitting in society a little bit. And it was like, they would have these extreme delusions. I mean, there's a difference between hallucinations and delusions, but they do often cross over, so people would think that, they were the soulmate of like Lucille Ball or something like that, and talk to Lucille Ball beyond the dead, the grave, and they'd be having yoga class, be like a yoga teacher. I actually met somebody that I won't blow his cover, but he was kind of like that. I mean, that was his scenario. And it wasn't Lucille Ball, though. It was somebody else. But anyway, but it was on the same level of stardom. You know, actually, it was even a bigger sex symbol than Lucille Ball, if you can imagine that. But so anyway, the idea was that, you know, how can I had been through a lot, you know, doing these drugs and getting into recovery and studying psychology. It's like, how can I help people that are like so far out there that there's no way for them to come back? Like I have a lot of symbolic, allegorical dreams, and I remember, you know, this one dream I had about going down a highway, and there was like, the only way you could get out of the highway is like to go over it. Like the highway, I think, was hallucinations. Like people are just, the more they hallucinate, it's like the worse they get, and the IQ can go down. So when you start like listening to inner speech, like your own speech as an external speech, that's when it can start to go, you know, really haywire. And so I was, you know, looking at the fact that, well, religious people hear a lot of voices and, you know, have all this experience. And then I realized, well, you know, there's divine experience that's actually from a higher place. And then there's subjective kind of like dream hemisphere stuff, where at night we have these hallucinations, but they're called dreams. And what happens with brain damage of different types through drug use or through psychosis, like, you know, physical abuse or neglect, emotional abuse, is that people, they kind of revert to like their dream hemisphere when they're waking. And so the book is, you know, trying to help people wake up from that. You know, basically that's a part of it. And it also kind of examines the fact that there's a lot of different aspects of schizophrenia, and only one of them is hallucinations. So it used to be that if you told a doctor that you're hearing voices, they would say, you're a schizophrenic, you know, but that's not the case. And I think my book might have helped change that a little bit, because it's been out for 13 years now. And so, you know, I've promoted it quite a bit, and now more and more people are openly talking about hearing voices and stuff, and it's not like they're being categorized as like a schizophrenic. And so yeah, that's the gist of that book.
So it kind of sounds like, you didn't say this outright, but earlier you had said that you deal with a homeless population, and I think you're involved with recovery in that aspect.
Right.
Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then I'm painting this picture in my head where you started to see these type of symptoms in people. You started to see schizophrenia in this homeless population and other individuals who you might be dealing with in a recovery sense. And you started to research this and gain more interest in it. And this eventually led to your book.
Yeah, that's correct.
That is so. I don't think that. I mean, from talking with you, I don't necessarily think that was just an offshoot. That it's just almost like a tangent in your life. I feel like you may have put this book together with the mind to help people through recovery.
Through recovery? Oh, yeah, you mean like maybe help get people like into being cautious about taking too many hallucinogens or something like that?
Sure. Is that kind of what it was?
Yeah, because like I said, like with the spirituality and genius model, I guess there's maybe a third model, which is like delusion. You know, like you know, where you get people thinking like it's the wish fulfillment. Like I want to be somebody so bad that I imagine that I am. That's grandiosity. You know, that's where you're creating kind of like an imaginary level of worth and power. And everybody should have worth, and you know, we're like created in the image of God kind of thing. I mean, everybody deserves respect unless they really prove otherwise, you know, doing something horrendous. But yeah, so that's basically true. I saw a lot of people that was really sad. You know, you'd see them downtown, and they just could not, understand reality at all. They were talking to themselves. You still see that today. I mean, And there's a book that I reference called Transient Psychosis, and so that just means like a passing psychosis. So a lot of very normal people. This is the really funny thing. A lot of very normal people have had those psychotic breaks, and they've had these episodes, and maybe people witnessed them, maybe people didn't, but they snap out of it, and often they're not very like altruistic about, you know, helping people that have gone through them. They just don't want anything to do with that anymore. You know, that's not me. You know, I was like that for a couple of weeks or whatever, but you know, now it's gone. So definitely, you know, unfortunately, the psychiatric industry is kind of like a penal thing. You know, like people are very fallible, and they will control and dominate people whenever they can because it makes them feel better about themselves. So, you know, if someone gets pegged as having a transient psychotic episode, they can get pegged that way for life, and then they, you know, used to get thrown in psychiatric hospitals for long periods of time. So yeah, the whole book was kind of about, there's a big movement about liberating people who've had mental health challenges.
Okay, and that you would put your book in with that movement.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess, man, honestly, like I kind of just want to go back and listen to this and try to figure it out. It's funny, when I called you, I was intending, like I thought we were going to start talking about religious experience and hallucinations, you know? And
oh, okay.
No. It wasn't, but that's kind of the cool thing with this is I kind of anticipate things, but it's more interesting to see where it goes. So I
do that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gets me in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Because I don't necessarily want to force a very specific conversation. And to be honest, if you go back and listen to some of my previous episodes, it's a lot of hallucinogens. You know, people readily talk about hallucinogens. It's difficult to find people who want to talk about their like what quote unquote harder drug use. Like I have one episode where the girl talks about her meth addiction and heroin addiction that she's in recovery for herself, which is it's one of my favorite episodes just because it's such a good cautionary tale, you know?
Oh yeah.
But again, like I don't have anything like this. I don't have a single episode that really talks about recovery.
Yeah. I'm interested in intersecting, you know, the place where, you know, people start wanting to be, you know, become geniuses and higher consciousness and mind expansion, and that I see that as happening in rare individuals. But the way to get there is to respect those rare individuals. And I'm not saying, you know, that that's an easy path as you go through life, because I think, especially in this day and age, there's not as much respect for them because we're living kind of in an age of narcissism, you know. So everybody, you know, the CEO is the rock star, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I actually do have one more question if you have time.
Sure.
Could you describe what you mean by the term genius and the term spiritual?
Sure. What I mean by genius is just people that have contributed to the progress in society, whether it's artistic or scientific or spiritual or activism, you know, things like that. Like, so there's certain people that have, you know, shouldered the burden or, you know, withheld the punches from life, and they, you know, they do great things. And then spiritual is like healing the wounds that life gives you. And, of course, bonding, like family bonding, like there's a 12-step group called Singles Anonymous that tries to develop long-term relationship skills, you know, like normal bonding with, you know, the opposite sex kind of thing. And so it's like that kind of mentality, overcoming the sexism and stuff, you know. So spirituality has a lot to do with, I think, the way we're raised. You know, if the parents are neglectful, if they're not really helping you achieve an adult life, sometimes it's hard to be spiritual, and then people have to really, you know, work at it. So that's kind of that's the difference between the two, for me.
Wow. Okay, that's kind of interesting. During the winter, I was given a book which I read called "The Road Less Traveled" by M. Scott Peck. And that book, usually I try to stray away from books that seem to be self-help, books.
Right.
And my buddy, it was this guy I went to school with, and I'm 33. He was 21, 22, so I kind of discounted his opinion to a certain degree, even though I knew he was very smart. And he recommended this book to me, and I read it, and I just looked back, and I really respected him a lot more because
Oh yeah, my mom gave me an audio tape of that, and I listened to it a ton of times. I love it. Yeah.
dude, it's so good. And honestly, like I needed it. I needed that book so bad. And in it, he kind of talks a little bit about, depending on how you're raised, that is going to heavily influence your perception of yourself. And I would say that your idea about spirituality falls into that where you're saying depending on how you're raised affects how your spirituality looks.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely, the people who have had redemption stories or, like the born again thing where they, were criminals or something, and then they change. So, I mean, it's possible where people, they say, unfortunately the cults kind of come in and they kind of snatch people up who've had that kind of bad upbringing too. But, there's always a lot of ways of adjusting oneself through it, but that's one of the problems, I think, in society today is that a lot of them are failing. They're not really maturing people to that, that you don't see as many like 20, 30-year marriages and stuff. People are just like, you conflicted with me too many times, so bye, that kind of thing. Instead of seeing it as like a healthy balance between different opinions that could be tolerated.
Dude, well, if it's cool with you, that's all I got. I don't know if there's anything you want to add or talk about, but I'll just call it for
Well,
now.
yeah, I mean, just quick sum up. I mean, it's kind of a stigma when people admit to using drugs, and even psychiatric drugs, no matter what people say, no matter what government programs, like, there's always going to be the stigma about drug use and whether it's legal or illegal. And, I think it's just something that people need to keep private, if they've used drugs, or if they are going to talk about recovery, I think that's a good thing because society really needs it right now.
Yeah.
So I think more people are taught in 12-step groups not to talk about, like Ringo Starr. A friend of mine was at a Ringo Starr's AA birthday party, and I guess other people like Eric Clapton and other movie stars and stuff like Dick Van Dyke have been, or in AA or whatever. But, there's a lot of people that they just don't talk about it, and they really should. They really should share more, even though supposedly we're not supposed to have a personality in press and radio and stuff like that. But I don't think that's really, rules are meant to be broken sometimes.
Well, I mean, shit. In the case of AA itself, I mean, you have Bill Wilson who, he advocated for specific drugs like LSD, psychedelic assisted therapy in treating substance use. Or at least that's what I'm reading about. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I don't know anything about that. I know that that's kind of swept under the carpet that supposedly Bill W. had used LSD. It was kind of actually I heard that he's not like our Jesus Christ or anything to the extent that I identify with the 12-step movement. He's like just the guy that's fallible, and like he was a womanizer, and a lot of people have a lot of dirt on him. I really don't. I'm not really into that kind of history of AA, but yeah, that's yeah. So that wouldn't really be the program. The programs are really against hallucinogens or any kind of narcotic use. There's not really a therapeutic aspect of LSD in 12-step programs.
I guess the only point I was getting at was that it's kind of cool to see how nothing is pristine. Nothing is squeaky clean, and what you're talking about with how AA advocates for people to share their experiences. By sharing those experiences, you're making yourself vulnerable by showing people that you are also not squeaky clean. So
right, you are. Yeah, it's the problem with the hypocrisy in society. People want to put on that strong image because it's very good for one's success. So one has to play that dance, dance that dance carefully. Like, how much do you want to divulge about yourself, or how much do you want to, not?
How do you decide what to reveal to society or to people who you don't know about your history and what you're interested in? I'm kind of curious how you dance that dance.
Well, yeah, I think the premise of society, unfortunately, is often a false premise, which is, creating this epidemic that we're having of people ODing on opiates, and then, all the other really dangerous drugs like meth, and the homelessness from people who've done a lot of hallucinogens or can't handle marijuana or alcohol. Because there are some people that's all they need, to get psychotic. And so, yeah, it's kind of a hypocritical stance that, okay, you might have done these things in the past, but you've overcome them. But just the fact that you're admitting it, we don't like that, because there are, I don't know what the percentage is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 70% or more. There's a lot of people that do not want to admit that they've ever done drugs, or they have never done drugs, and that pretension always is the thing that hurts society the most. There's a lot of examples of it. If people can talk about things and be honest, they don't have to disclose everything about their past. I think that's usually stupid to do that, because, again, there's that false front, that false face that people use to get by and to be powerful. So I would not volunteer any information. That would be my first rule of thumb. And there's a lot of medical privacy today that you don't have to have people, allow people access to your medical records and things like that. You don't have to tell people you're in recovery. That's what the anonymous aspect is all about. It's supposed to be that if you meet somebody, like, say, if you're in a support group and you meet somebody in public and there's other people around you, you don't do what they call breaking someone's anonymity. So you don't say, "Oh, hi, Jane, I saw you at that 12-step meeting last Thursday," and there's all these other people around overhearing it. Somebody who's got a higher level of intelligence recovery never does that to somebody, but it can happen to you. When you're in public, somebody just comes up and they start talking about recovery to you, and you might be around your employer or something. So there are, in recovery, you do meet some people that are fairly uneducated, I guess you could say, and I'm not talking about college education or high school education. They just don't seem to have, much of an insight in the damage that they can do, and that can happen. So,
but for you, through our conversation, I mean, a person could tell that you're well-read, you're intelligent, you're thoughtful. It seems like you're doing okay for yourself. Yet, you, just like you said at the beginning, you censor yourself, and other people, I guarantee, they obviously do that. Hence the anonymity in AA. Why do people care so much? Why does society care so much about your past drug use, especially if it seems like you have benefited from that and you're actually helping people because of it?
Oh, well, I wouldn't really say that I benefited so much from my drug use. As far as, like, psychiatric medication that I might have dabbled in, that might have helped me kind of to clarify my points. I have a pretty biblical background. Like, it says God made the herbs. The wise man abhors not the herbs. The trees of the field will be, or trees of the, the leaves of the trees will be used for healing and things like that. And whether or not that's symbolic or not, I think the idea that God made medication, like marijuana, might be one. Now, my personal view on marijuana is that it's just like opium. Like, you can abuse it, or it could be used medicinally. And if you have a need to get high, then you're going to abuse opium or marijuana or alcohol, whatever that is. And so, I would say that how I look at the drug problem right now and what I would disclose to an employer, I wouldn't have a problem with. But maybe if you were to describe what I believe, that might become problematic. It's kind of like that telephone thing where you tell one person something and then they change it just a tiny bit and the next person changes it more and more. So my point of view is that I think I've been hurt more by my use of marijuana and hallucinogens than I've been helped personally. That's my view. But I'm not going to necessarily pass judgment on people that use medicinal marijuana. My problem is that I think there's a difference between the expanded consciousness kind of experience of LSD and marijuana to what happens in your spiritual life. And in your spiritual life, it's a slow process, but there's all kinds of miracles that can happen. So I don't fill in all the blanks. I don't know what, as a Christian, I don't know what God thinks about people who are Buddhist or, the whole thing in the Bible, it has a lot of things where it talks about people in other cultures. If they're righteous, then, they're righteous, and don't be deceived, he who's righteous is righteous, and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of, problems just saying that these medications or these drugs, for one person, it's the same thing as another. So somebody might need that opium because they have cancer, and that opium kills the pain, but somebody might just be like zoning out, having a delusion about something, and they really shouldn't be using opium. They should be maybe just deep breathing, focusing on their breath or something.
I like your point about you not necessarily having an issue with telling people about your history. What you do have an issue with is what they tell somebody else and how it's kind of like a game of telephone.
Right.
That's really illuminating. I never even thought about it like that, but that's absolutely correct. In fact, I would almost say that I'm kind of one of those people who, for the most part, go uncensored, and when in reality I should be a little more censored for that specific reason. I might tell something to somebody and hopefully they get what I am trying to convey to them, but I can't control what they go off and say to somebody else. Even if they understood me perfectly, is that person going to understand them perfectly? And eventually it goes from, say, oh, I was a heroin addict and now I cleaned up and I actually work with addicts now in helping them recover.
Yeah.
And I'm doing great. And now, then somebody else eventually down the line, it just goes, oh, Philip's a heroin addict.
Yeah, exactly. And can't you see the hypocrisy behind it all? Because who do we love in the theaters? What music do we love? We love all these recovered addicts,
and non-recovered
recovered alcohol, and yeah, exactly. It's all hypocrisy. It's like our idols can be recovered addicts or even using addicts, but not somebody that we might be next to, at work. So, yeah, that's my take on it. Is that don't expect to have a free ride if you start talking about your history with drug abuse. That's why it's called anonymous.
This episode was produced by me, Philip Johnson. You can find a list of all songs used in the description section of this episode. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe. Also, leave a review. I'd really appreciate it. Lastly, if you have a story that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. Shoot me an email at psychotropicpodcast@hotmail.com and let's make something happen. Thanks again, everybody. See you next time.